Hi everyone. We're going to give an introduction to the Semi-Slav Defense in this video. So the Semi-Slav Defense is a queen's pawn opening, and it's a queen's gambit. And here the queen's gambit declined would be the move e6 to support the pawn. And one of the drawbacks of that move e6 is it will block in the light squared bishop. Well, black can try the move c6 instead, which leads to either the Slav defense or the semi-Slav defense. And this keeps the diagonal open for the light squared bishop. And it still supports the pawn on d5. There are trade-offs, though. In the queen's gambit declined with e6, there are a lot of lines where black likes to play this pawn to c5 to attack white's center at some point. So in the Slav or semi-Slav with c6, black doesn't do that. But he does keep the diagonal open for his light squared bishop. Okay, good developing move here for white is knight to f3 towards the center, getting closer to kingside castling. And black can play knight f6, and now knight c3, another sensible developing move, controlling the e4 square. And now if black takes the pawn on c4. This is known as the Slav defense. But if instead black plays e6, this is called the semi-Slav defense. So black builds a really strong central pawn formation here, makes a nice little triangle or pyramid formation in the semi-Slav. Now there are two main moves white can make in this position. He can make the modest move e3 to open the diagonal for the light squared bishop, which now protects the c4 pawn. But the drawback of that is it at least temporarily blocks in the dark squared bishop. Instead of e3, white can also try to get that bishop out to g5 first before he pushes to e3, so the bishop is outside the pawn chain. Okay, let's look at e3 first. After e3, one of black's plans in this opening is to take the pawn on c4 and then follow up with the pawn push to b5 after white recaptures with the bishop. He doesn't really want to do it right now and allow white to capture immediately with bishop takes c4. He would love it if white first moved the bishop out, then black can capture, and white would have to spend another tempo in recapturing. So a useful waiting move for black, a good developing move, is knight b d7. That's where that knight is headed anyway, since the c6 square is taken. That's where that knight belongs in the semi-Slav. So now white typically plays bishop to d3. However, he can delay that move and hope to try to get bishop takes c4 in one move. Another possibility is queen to c2 in the position, which is also a useful waiting move. And we'll look at that in a few minutes. But first, let's look down the main line, bishop to d3. So this allows black to capture on c4 and make white spend another tempo, and then black expands on the queen side with b5. This line of the semi-Slav is called the Moran variation, M-E-R-A-N, the Moran. And here white typically retreats the bishop back to d3. You can move it to b3, that's a more rare move, but from d3 it supports the e4 square, and white would like to push in the center. Okay, now the idea of making this move b5 is to get that square on b7 to fianchetto the light squared bishop here, and to get that square opened up with a tempo. When you play b5, you're hitting that bishop on c4, you're gaining that tempo. So eventually black would like to put that bishop there. But also black would like to now push his c-pawn forward to c5 and attack white's center. But if he does that, his b5 pawn will fall. So he can prepare that move by playing a6, and that supports the b5 pawn and allows the c pawn to come forward. And now white takes the time to play e4 and expand in the center, and now his dark squared bishop is opened up, and black follows through with his plan of playing c5, hitting white's center, and now there's a nice open diagonal here for his light squared bishop. Okay, from this position, there are two common moves for white we'll look at, e5 and d5. Let's look at e5 first. So that attacks the knight on f6, and what black generally does is capture the pawn on d4 and counterattack white's knight on c3. Okay, now here it's important for white to make the following desperado move. Knight takes b5, getting his knight off of that c3 square, taking a pawn down with him. Now, there's another move you might consider here. You might wonder what happens if white takes that knight. Well, it gives black a really good position after black captures white's knight, and now it turns out white should not take on g7 because that brings the black bishop out to g7, and now white can't recapture the pawn on c3 because bishop takes c3 would fork the king and the rook. So white has to leave this pawn here, and instead he might take the pawn on c3. Now he has this isolated pawn, and what black generally does is actually not take that pawn back on f6. The main move here is knight to c5, which attacks the bishop on d3. Black is happy to give a pawn back in the position and allow white to capture on g7, which gives black a tempo to bring his bishop out. So black wants very quick development. And so here black is doing really well. The engine says it's like negative 1.9. All right, so that's what would happen if white took the knight on f6 instead of making this desperado move. So white should make that desperado move, and then black captures the knight, and now white captures the knight. And here black will generally recapture with his pawn in order to support a really strong center. He'll push his pawn to e5, and it's equal material. Well, actually black is up a pawn in the position, although this pawn is weak and white may win it, and it may result in equal material. Notice white cannot win it right now because there's a fork. Queen to a5 check would pick up the bishop. So white has to wait on that. He'll probably castle in this position. Okay, going back to right here, instead of pushing e5, another move white sometimes makes is d5. So after d5, black can expand his queenside pawns and attack the bishop. The bishop usually falls back to c2, staying in contact with that e4 square. And now black can put his queen on c7, white can castle, and the black bishop goes to b7. And at this point, white can take the pawn on e6 and saddle black with an isolated pawn. And we get a really interesting position that's pretty balanced with equal chances. Black does have this weak pawn here, but he does have a lot of space on the queen side. Okay, so that's just an overview of the Moran variation in the Semi-Slav. With one more point I wanted to make. I mentioned earlier sometimes white doesn't play bishop to d3 right away and hopes to take on c4 in one move, so he can delay that with queen to c2. So if white plays that, then black probably shouldn't take the pawn yet and give white a chance to move his bishop first. And a good waiting move for black is bishop to d6. It's a good active square for that dark squared bishop. And now white generally gives in and plays bishop to d3, and then we get a position similar to the one we've seen before, where black's plan is to expand here with c5. Okay, the difference is these pieces are now out. All right, so let's back all the way up to the other possibility in this position. Instead of locking in the dark square bishop, white can try to get it out to g5. And this is a pawn sacrifice. Black can take the pawn on c4 and then hold on to it with b5. And that can be a very double-edged, dangerous tactical position if black goes for that. So he may want to play more calmly. For example, black can play bishop to e7, and this just transposes into standard Queen's Gambit declined lines where black has played a c6, which is the usual response when white plays rook to c1 anyway. So this is just a Queen's Gambit declined. Another possibility is black playing knight b d7 to support that knight. And then if white plays the natural, most popular move in the position, e3, black even has the option of playing queen a5, and this has transposed into the Cambridge Springs defense of the Queen's Gambit declined. And I made another video on that if you check my Queen's Gambit declined playlist. Okay, so those are some options if you see, as black, if you see bishop to g5 coming. Another option, instead of grabbing the gambit pawn, is playing h6. And here white has two choices. If he takes the knight on f6, then black will recapture with the queen, and it will be a very quiet variation after e3. This is called the Moscow variation, and it's not as explosive tactically as other variations. Or if white wants to here, he can retreat the bishop to h4, and this can become a sharper game. Black can cut the bishop off, it can go back to g3, and then if black wants to, he can accept that gambit pawn and allow white this strong center, and then black can reinforce that pawn on c4. So that's another way to play. Okay, but the main line here after bishop to g5 is for black to accept the pawn sacrifice on c4. And this is known as the Botvinnik variation, and it's quite wild. It's a great counter-attacking opening for black. If black wants some chances to win, that's a great way to play this line. All right, and now white will grab the center with e4, and that threatens to win the pawn on c4, and white is also threatening to push the pawn to e5 and attack that pinned knight. So black bolsters the pawn and keeps his gambit pawn by playing b5, and then white does play e5. Now the way black saves the piece here is he plays h6, counterattacking the bishop, and the bishop falls back to h4 and keeps the pin, but then black counterattacks the bishop again and cuts off the bishop from pinning the knight. Now here, white's best move is knight takes g5, temporarily sacrificing a piece here on the g5 square because that knight is now pinned, it's not going anywhere, and white can regain the piece at any time. And white is in fact threatening to play bishop takes f6, which would fork the queen and the rook. So black needs to do something about that, and the normal move here is knight b d7 to support that knight, and then white takes it. And in this Botvinnik variation, it's kind of interesting that it was white who gambited that pawn, but after following the main line in the Botvinnik variation, it's actually white who is up a pawn in the position, and black is down a pawn. Okay, so what does black get in compensation for the loss of his pawn? Well, he has a nice open h-file for his rook, and white does have an isolated d-pawn that black can attack. Black also has a nice pawn formation here on the queen side, which will enable him to enact a queenside castling idea, and his king will be quite safe over there. So black gets some good counter-attacking chances in this opening. And black usually begins with bishop to b7 and tries to seize this long diagonal and get closer to queenside castling. The best way to counter that bishop for white is to fianchetto his own bishop. He should play g3 in this position. It looks a little dangerous because your rook is loose on the h1 square, and black should indeed play c5 to get a discovered attack on that rook and also to attack the center. But white has everything under control with the move d5, blocking that diagonal. And here black typically plays queen to b6 to get ready to castle, and that queen is nicely supporting that b5 pawn and the e6 pawn as well. I'll point out that black should not get greedy and try to win a pawn on d5 by playing b4 to remove the defender here. This is just a winning position for white after bishop takes c4, sacrificing the knight because white has this great move d takes e6, opening up the diagonal and letting black capture the rook, but he can't do it because e takes f7 is a mate in the position. So black has only one defense here, which is f takes e6, but then white has f7 check with a discovered attack on the queen, and white wins the queen here in this position, and he's up material and his attack is unstoppable. That knight is hanging, the rook is hanging, the queen can come here and target this pawn. So white's attack is really unstoppable. All right, so back to the main move here. Don't get greedy. You're going to play queen to b6. And then that gives white time to finish his fianchetto, bishop to g2, and then both sides castle on opposite wings. Now black can play b4 and threaten that knight. And there's a couple moves white can make here. You can play knight to a4 and attack the queen. Or if you want to really mix things up, you can sacrifice the knight and play rook to b1 with the idea of opening the b file here and start attacking that black king. So the Botvinnik variation can be tactically quite wild, and it's worth a lot of study if you're going to play it with either side. All right, so that is my introduction to the Semi-Slav defense. I hope you learned something. I sure did.